In this lecture, we're going to continue with some of the protocols that we use online. And we start that off with email protocols. We already talked about how SMTP, POP3, and IMAP are email protocols. They're port 25, 110, and 143. Now, let's look a little bit at the traffic flow when you actually send an email, how it happens, and the servers that we use. If you look at the image over here on the right, you can see I am sending Jane an email. I send that email from my mail user agent, that could be Outlook or whatever else. I format it and send the message as SMTP to my mail submission agent. That is our email server. That server then determines the destination address, in this case, jane@b.org. The MSA then resolves the fully qualified domain name of the mail server in their DNS. We then send a DNS request to the name server for that domain, in this case, b.org. The b.org name server replies back with a mail exchange record for their domain. In this case, that is mx.b.org. Then it sends an SNMP message to Jane's company email server. If this is a small organization, maybe they have 1 or 2 servers. In larger organizations, they likely have many. If they do have many, then the message is forwarded to the mail server that Jane is attached to. The MDA, or mail delivery agent, sends the email to Jane's account, and her mail user agent or email program picks the message up using POP3 or IMAP, and Jane can now read my email. Now, do you need to know this for the exam? And my answer is going to be the same this time as it has been all the other times. If it is in the curriculum, you need to know it. So we send the email to our email server. Our email server sends a request to their DNS asking for the address of their mail server. It replies back. We send the message to that mail server. The mail server forwards to the recipient, and the recipient can now read the email. We very briefly touched on DNS or domain name system earlier, and we also used it in the mail example 20 seconds ago. That was a DNS request. And what DNS really does is it translates a server domain name into a real IP. You can remember it from the Google example earlier. We don't type the IP into our browser. We type thorteaches.com, and then DNS resolves that into the actual address. And remember, DNS uses TCP and UDP port 53, and it uses getHost by name or getHost by address when it sends the request. The authoritative name server is the authority for a given namespace. If we think back to the email example, then probably the name server would be for b.org. And depending on our configuration, so my a.org mail server might keep that cached for a while. So if I send an email to Jane again, well then the next time, assuming it is still cached, it just sends the email to their server. If it is still cached, we completely skip the name server. Then we have a recursive name server. That is a server that tries to resolve all the names it doesn't know already. That way, whenever that name is needed, it doesn't have to do the extra step to look it up for that specific domain it is sending the email to. It already has it. Now, like almost anything else that was developed for IPv4, DNS is natively a trusting protocol. It uses UDP for most requests, and it has no authentication built in natively. We can technically add it, but most people don't. And that is really the reason why many attackers use DNS poisoning. It works pretty much the same way that ARP poisoning did. The attacker sends a fake name and IP address combo to another DNS server, and the server then keeps that DNS record until it expires. If we use the example with their email, they might send b.org is this IP address, which obviously is the wrong one. So whenever I try to send my email to Jane, it will be sent to the wrong mail server. So assuming we want to do DNS securely, we can use DNSSEC, and that is just DNS security extension. That can provide us the authentication and integrity using PKI encryption. It does not provide confidentiality. You can think of this as digital signatures for our DNS services. Now in the email example, if we wanted confidentiality, integrity, and non-repudiation for that email, well then we would have used digital signatures. I encrypt my message with my private key and her public key. Anyone can get access to my public key, but they don't have her private key. So the only person that should be able to decrypt that message should be Jane. Now let's look at SNMP, and do not confuse this with SMTP. That is the Mail Delivery Protocol. This is Simple Network Management Protocol. And as you can hear from the name, we use this to manage our network. And what that really means is we monitor the devices on our network, our routers, our switches, servers, even HVAC units or UPSs in our data centers. Really anything we can assign an IP address to, we can monitor. And for that to work, we need to have an SNMP client installed and enabled on the client. And depending on the version of SNMP, it can either report up or down, or in version 2 or 3, we get a lot more granularity. In version 2 and 3, we can see a device traffic utilization, the internal temperature, memory use, how much of the hard disk is used, what percentage the HVAC is running at, how much battery power is left on our UPS, and on and on. So a very useful tool to keep an eye on our environment, and it can help us prevent future incidents. But as with many early versions of any of the protocols, they are sent in clear text. SNMP version 1 and 2, the data is sent in clear text. Bad idea. SNMP 1 should really be completely avoided, right? 2, technically the same, but it is still very widely used. Well, as you know by now, clear text over the network is a bad idea, because anyone who's able to sniff our network can get access to all our data. And where SNMP 1 just shows up and down, with 2, you can actually manage our systems. So if we use SNMP 2 and an attacker gets hold of our credentials, they can shut systems down, they can reconfigure them, they can shut interfaces down, which is one of the reasons why SNMP 2 is so much more dangerous than 1. Because now they're not just capturing our plaintext, now they can go in and break things using that plaintext. Which then brings us to what we want to use. SNMP version 3. Here we encrypt everything that gives us the confidentiality, integrity, and availability that we want. And that really should be the standard across any organization. And I say should here because I have seen many places where people are just too lazy to change to 3. And now that we're on the topic of SNMP, let's talk about the SolarWinds hack. I think SolarWinds was the most widely used monitoring tool across the industry, and I think pretty much anywhere where I have worked, we have used it, even some of the places I have helped implement SolarWinds. It is a pretty easy tool to use. You can monitor your entire system, all your data centers, whatever you have, and it is relatively easy to configure. At some point, actually, I was SolarWinds certified. I let it lapse because I never used it, but still, the point stands. Huge company, used in most places. And that is one of the threats we face today that is growing fast, very fast, is third-party applications. And for the attackers, it is such an appealing target because they just have to hack one company, and through that company, they effectively attack thousands or 10,000s of customers. The attackers were able to insert malicious code into the SolarWinds code that then got pushed to everybody of their customers with the regular updates. And in this case, 18,000 or so companies were identified as being affected by the hack. And once the attacker is on our network, they can do all sorts of bad things. So the SolarWinds hack is one of the examples we have where we can tell Zero Trust is something that we need going forward. And if you are unfamiliar with Zero Trust, it is basically what it sounds like: never trust, always verify, and it has 3 core principles. Secure access. No one and nothing gets access to the network until they are authenticated, authorized, and verified. Then we have least privilege. You give them the least possible amount of access they need to do their job. No more. And then finally, we log and monitor everything. Now, I'm not going to say that this is going to stop future hacks like the SolarWinds hack. It's not going to. But on our system, this can help us contain it. We talked about HTTP and HTTPS earlier. They're the protocols that we use to transport our HTML data. They are not HTML. HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Remember, that's the one that uses port 80, 8008, and 8080. not really used very much anymore because it sends all the traffic unencrypted over the internet. I mean, you can still find HTTP websites, but they are getting more rare. Lots of good reasons why they're becoming more rare, and HTTPS sites are becoming more the norm. It is pretty cheap, it's easy to implement, it gives us that extra layer of security, and it looks good for our customers. HTTPS just means HTTP secure. It uses port 443, and it can, if configured for it, use port 8443. All the traffic we send over HTTPS is encrypted, and again, a quick reminder, HTML is what we send, HTTP or HTTPS is how we send it. Don't confuse them. And when I reiterate things like this, you probably think, yeah, Thor, I know that. You just mentioned that 3 times. But I mention it 3 times because I have had student feedback where they say, oh, right, that's the difference. That's why I missed those questions on my exam. So something this basic you should never be confused about. Alright, rant off, let's go back to the slide. If you look at the images over here on the right at the top, you can see first thorteaches.com. It has a little padlock next to it. That is a secure connection. Then the one further to the right, that is not a secure connection. That is just HTTP. Now, on some websites, it might not matter. You might not enter any information on that website. It doesn't matter if anyone can intercept the traffic. But with as easy as HTTPS is to implement and as cheap as it is there really any point in not using it? And then finally, the image at the bottom on the right, that is actual HTML. And that's the language that websites are written in, and the one you need to not confuse with HTTP and HTTPS. Now let's finish this lecture with looking at BootP and DHCP. BootP is really just the Bootstrap protocol, and that's the protocol we use on our diskless workstations to determine this is the OS we need to download. And if you remember back, that is the one we download with TFTP, and the IP we got using reverse ARP. On most systems, the BIOS support BootP, meaning we can download the operating system without having a disk. And that's probably as deep as you need to know BootP, which then brings us to DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And that is the protocol we use to assign our IP addresses. In most environments, we would have a DHCP server that either statically or dynamically assign IPs to our clients. This is using the private addresses, and if you're at your house, well then most likely everything is going to be dynamically assigned. You plug in a networking cable to a device or you connect to the wireless and you're online. In most cases, you have no clue which IP is assigned. You don't care about it. Why should you? And I say in most cases because I know a lot of you have devices on your network that actually has a static IP. So maybe at home and definitely at our organizations, we have static IPs assigned to certain devices. In most cases, we only assign static IPs to devices that matter. That is definitely our servers or any device that is important that traffic is sent to, and it needs to keep the same address. Now for all the workstations in our organizations, we probably just use dynamic addresses. The addresses that are statically assigned, we exclude those from the DHCP pool. Let's say we use the entire 10 network. 16 million addresses, we have plenty for everything. We can then say the 10.1 network, that is for anything that is statically assigned. Then the 10.2 network, that is for people who need a dynamic IP. Then in that case, we would have a DHCP pool on our server, and then we would have a list that is excluded. That means these will never be dynamically assigned. And then whenever a workstation loads up for the first time, it says, hey, I need an IP address. I don't care what it is. Well, then it gets assigned something that is not on the excluded list. In this case, it would get a 10.2 address. Both BootP and DHCP uses UDP port 67 for the server and UDP port 68 for the client. And then finally, for the exam, I would probably also know how DHCP discovery works. If you look at the graphics over here on the right, you can see the client sends a discovery saying, hey, I would like an IP address. The server then sends an offer. Hey, here's your IP address. The client replies back, Thank you, I will take it. The server acknowledges, and that IP address is now assigned to you. Again, oversimplified, but this is essentially how it works. Most servers are configured to give you that IP address for a certain amount of time. Your lease has X days to expiration. Let's say in your organization, you get an IP for 4 days. And this is something we do to make sure that we don't have IPs floating around out there that we're not using that hasn't been assigned to a device for a year. So every 4 days, that lease will be retired unless you renew the lease. The clients are configured to, as default, request the IP to be renewed at the half of the lease. That means after 2 days, it says, hey, can I keep my IP? The server then says, yes, this is your IP again. It renews the 4-day lease. And again, 2 days later, you say, hey, can I keep this address? The server says yes, and so on. So we keep that IP address by renewing it over and over at the half point of the duration, and we keep it until either the lease expires, meaning we don't renew it, or we release it from the server. And with that, we are done with this lecture. I will see you in the next one.